Good morning to those who have joined the call. We will be starting in just a couple of minutes. And this is an event that is being recorded. Just wanted you to be aware of that. We will begin momentarily. Good morning to those who have joined. I think we're just waiting for a few more to join. To staff who are producers on this, are we ready to get started?
Yep, we're ready to go when you are, Katie.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning to everyone who has joined us here this morning. Welcome. We are here today to present a draft of an ordinance that city staff, in partnership with a consultant who has been hired by the city to assist, have been working on this year. And the purpose of the meeting is to share an overview of what's included in the draft and to get feedback from attendees today, and also to answer questions that you may have. My name is Katie Topinka. I'm the Policy Research and Outreach Manager in the city's Community Planning and Economic Development Department. There are several city departments that have been part of the team working on this draft. They include CPED, Regulatory Services, and the City Attorney's Office. Also on the call today from the city staff team are Roxanne Kimball, who manages our homeownership programs in CPED, Megan Waldis-Mayette, who is on the Regulatory Services team, Joel Fussy from the City Attorney's Office, and then Michelle Basham, who is our consultant, who will be presenting shortly. Before I turn it over to Michelle, just wanted to give a little bit of background about where we are in this process today. Megan is going to publish a website that also lays this out, so you could take a look if you'd like. Back in September of 2019, the City Council held a study session where it had guests from Washington, D.C. to talk about the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act that is in effect in Washington, D.C. After that time, the city engaged with Twin Cities LISC and an organization called the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development out of Washington, D.C. The city hired them through a request for proposal process to do a study on potential opportunity to purchase policy options for the city of Minneapolis. They presented that report in November of 2020 to the City Council. And then after that, in March of this year, the City Council adopted a staff direction directing staff to draft an ordinance based on one of the policy options out of that report, and providing a framework for the draft ordinance that you will be receiving a presentation about today. And so since that time, city staff together with Michelle have been working on the draft ordinance. And so the goal of today's meeting is to be able to present to you what we have been working on as a staff team, and then also to get feedback. The draft ordinance we're sharing today is really a result of the work that aligned with the staff direction we received in March. It is important to note that starting in January, the makeup of the City Council will change along with the city government structure. An opportunity to purchase ordinance would have to be reintroduced by a new council. There will not be a public hearing on this version of the ordinance prior to the new City Council being seated in January. So we don't know at this time what these changes mean for the ordinance, other than that it will have to be reintroduced. But as I've already said, we are sharing it today and seeking feedback based on the direction that staff received from the current City Council earlier this year. We will update stakeholders as we know more in the future, and if the ordinance is reintroduced, we will do additional stakeholder meetings. So what to expect from today's meeting? Again, we're providing an overview of the ordinance draft that we currently have. We're going to have an informational presentation from Michelle Basham, our consultant, in just a moment. After that, we will have time for questions and answers. The questions, we are asking that they be entered in the chat, and they will be read by staff and answered that way. That's how we'll handle the question and answer session. And then after that, we will have time for audience members to provide comments either in the chat or live if you'd like to share a comment verbally, and we will be putting information, call-in information in the chat. You will have to call in to verbally share your comment, and you will have to unmute yourself by pressing *6. We will repeat those directions when we get to that point in the presentation. And then on the website that was shared, I believe the link was shared with you earlier, there's also a place to submit written comments. And there's a survey. So those are other ways you can provide feedback on this draft ordinance. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to begin the presentation, and then we will have time for Q&A and comments. Thank you again for being here, and I'll just repeat one more time that this session is being recorded for your awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you everyone for making the time to be here today. We appreciate this opportunity to discuss this important ordinance with you. Next slide, please. So this has been in process for a while now. But the opportunity to purchase ordinance really aligns with a lot of important city goals and emergent policy issues that we have been concerned about and talking about for a while, primarily related to racial disparities in homeownership rates, as well as addressing our housing goals around BIPOC homeownership in particular, the city's Minneapolis 2040 plan, which many people have heard about, our unified housing policy, and preserving affordable housing as much as we can. We tried in the development of this policy to balance rights of renters with rights of property owners, and also create opportunities for new home ownership of rental properties. Next slide, please. So some of the opportunities and benefits of the opportunity to purchase ordinance for renters. Excuse me. It'll create opportunities for renters to become homeowners for the first time, and also creates a clear pathway for them to do that, including required periods of time for them to do certain things like secure financing, submit a statement of interest. It also obligates property owners to do certain things, like provide a statement of intent to sell, and allow their renters an opportunity to organize, form a tenants organization, a renters organization, secure financing, and pursue a purchase of a rental property before it is sold on the third-party market. Next slide, please. It also creates opportunities for nonprofit organizations and as well as BIPOC developers and smaller developers to get into the rental market and purchase rental properties, either small rental properties or larger rental properties, and creates a pathway for that. It allows sales of properties covered by the ordinance to not, although they will not always exceed a typical sales timeline outlined in the ordinance, it does allow for potentials. There's an anticipation in the ordinance of sellers receiving a financial, property owners receiving a financial incentive for participating in this process in recognition of the time that they're participating in this process as opposed to going to the private market. It also allows the city an opportunity, and we'll talk about that too in a little bit, because it is a cascading rights process, but it will allow the city of Minneapolis, if the renters are not interested, to also step in and purchase a property to preserve affordable housing options for residents. One of the things that the city is particularly interested in is that in the city of Minneapolis, Minneapolis residents has become a majority renter city. And that's part of what is driving this, is wanting to make sure that we're thoughtful about rental properties across the city of Minneapolis. Next slide, please. So the basic presumption is that all rental properties are covered by this ordinance unless specifically excluded. And the exclusions include small properties. This is small properties owned, meaning properties with 1 to 4 units, owned by individuals who have 5 or fewer rental licenses within the city of Minneapolis. Or if other conditions exist, like it's an owner-occupied duplex, or there's an accessory dwelling unit which the property owner lives in, or some other family member of the property owner, new construction less than 10 years old, group housing or assisted living. These are going to be properties that tend to be licensed either by the Department of Human Services or the Minnesota Department of Health, housing cooperatives, and certain types of subsidized housing that may have federal, state, or local covenants that would allow an opportunity, that would not allow an opportunity to purchase, excuse me. There's also certain exemptions provided as a result of transfers within properties, after somebody's death, or transfers related to a revocable trust. Transfers could happen before somebody dies as well, or transfers after somebody's death as a product of their estate. Transfers of property to a public agency based on a court order, or limited types of corporate and transfers based on a fractional interest with no consideration, meaning no financial interest involved. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we tried to be very thoughtful about as part of this process is really analyzing the impact of the exclusions on what we call SREAP zip codes, which stands for Strategic Racial Equity Action Plan zip codes, which includes the 2 zip codes in North Minneapolis, 55411, as well as 55412, and also 55404 in South Minneapolis. And what we found in particular, the exclusion for small properties owned by individuals, is that the impact is that 23% of the rental properties in Minneapolis are in SREAP zip codes, and 77% are in other zip codes. Next slide. Thank you. So going a little bit further into that analysis of the exemption on SREAP zip codes. So again, with small unit properties, those are small unit rental properties with only 1 to 4 units, subject to the opportunity to purchase ordinance. will be 18%. Exempt will be 82%. With the caveat being this is based on our available licensing data, which does have some limitations to our data, but that is our best estimate. And in SREAP zip codes, or citywide, 18% would be subject, exempt would be 82%. In SREAP specific zip codes, 31% would be subject to the ordinance and 69% would be exempt. Next slide. So this is these are pie charts showing the same data, just different ways. So citywide, again, 18% of properties that are small units, 1 to 4 units, would be covered, and 82% would be exempt in SREAP specific zip codes. Again, 55411, 55412, and 55404, which is North Minneapolis, and 1 zip code in South Minneapolis. 31% would be covered and 69% would be exempt. Next slide, please. So next we're going to outline the process of how the ordinance works. So there's several steps to the process, and the very first thing that happens is a property owner decides that they're going to sell their building. If they do that, they have to notify the renters and the city and any registered qualified organizations of an intent to sell, and then those entities and individuals have an opportunity to submit a statement of interest. As I mentioned earlier, the ordinance takes a cascading rights approach to this. So first, the right goes to renters or renters organizations. If renters or renter organizations either do not respond within the required period of time or expressly decline their right under the ordinance or assign their rights to a qualified organization, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, then the next thing that would happen, or the next groups that would have an opportunity after that, would be qualified organizations and the city of Minneapolis. Qualified organizations, we're going to have a competitive RFP process to identify qualified organizations, which are going to be organizations that have experience with and a commitment to affordable housing, who would be able to participate in this process. Renters will have a specified period of time based on the number of units in the building to submit a statement of interest. Like I said, if they don't, then the right would fall to qualified organizations in the city of Minneapolis. There's some other requirements in the ordinance that fall on renters, but the requirements are really intended to protect renters in the process. Renters in larger unit buildings, specifically defined as 5 or more units, would be required to form a renters organization to represent all of the renters in the building on an ongoing basis. And they would be required to work with a supportive partner. The city will also create an RFP process to identify supportive partners to work with renters and renter organizations. The role of the supportive partners is to help renters and renter organizations navigate the process of purchasing a building, securing financing, and then thinking about things like how do you manage rental property on an ongoing basis. And these would be groups, again, certified by the selected and certified by the city of Minneapolis on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. Renters in smaller buildings, so 2 to 4 units, would not need to form a renters organization or be required to work with a supportive partner. However, a majority of the renters in that building would have to agree that 1 or more of the renters in the building could proceed with their rights under the ordinance. If the majority does not agree, which we identified as a simple majority, 51% or more, then any one of the renters in the building could still pursue an attempted purchase of the rental building. However, they would not have the rights guaranteed to them under this ordinance. Once a party, be it the renters, the renter organization, a qualified organization, or the city decides to proceed, the next step would be they would submit a statement of interest. Next slide, or next, thank you. And then after that, they would submit an offer and go through the steps like securing, providing earnest money, securing financing. As this is going along throughout the ordinance, there are periods of time at each step required for the property owner to allow them to do these things like secure financing and do the things required to proceed with the purchase. Once an offer is accepted, they also have to allow them time to secure financing and close the transaction. Next slide, please. So in this slide, it's a graphic of the process as I was explaining it before, with the added step that we have not discussed yet. If the owner, I just want to point out on the right side in blue, underneath renter OTP ends if no statement of interest is submitted. If the owner, if a party does submit an offer and that offer is rejected, then the renter organization or city or qualified organizations that did submit a statement of interest within the required period of time have a right of first refusal under the ordinance, meaning if they submitted an offer and the property owner rejected it, and then it went to market, and then they got and then they had an offer from some other party on the regular market, then the renter organization, city or qualified organizations would have a right of first refusal under the ordinance. Is another right that is protected within the ordinance. Next slide, please. On this slide, the only difference between this slide and the previous slide is that this shows you the times that are provided. I'm not going to go through all of them except to say that we do have a website on the City of Minneapolis with a lot of details regarding the ordinance, including the ordinance itself and this presentation if you want to look at any of this, including the timelines for each of these steps, which again is dependent on the number of units in the rental property. Next slide, please. So one of the things that the city is going to do is take, because we want to, this is a big complex ordinance, and we would be one of the only significant large municipalities in the country to have implemented it. We want to take a phased-in approach so that we can do this thoughtfully and correctly. And this phased-in approach would start with single-family duplexes, single-family rental housing, as well as duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. And then we progress up to larger buildings. By the time we get to phases 4 and 5, in the 4th and 5th columns there, or 4th and 5th lines, we get to all building sizes. We started with smaller unit rentals based on the feedback from some of the members of the community. However, all of this is contingent on adequate resources in terms of funding and staffing to be able to implement this in a thoughtful and meaningful way so that it can be successful. Next slide, please. That is the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So at this time, we will move into Q&A. So I believe Megan will help us. I can't see the questions, Megan, so I don't know if I'm supposed to.
I can see them. Yep, they've been coming in, so we have a few ready to go. So I'll go ahead and I'll read them, and then I'll also post them into the chat for everybody to see as well. So let's see, the first one we have is, has there been any discussion of applying TOPA to commercial buildings? Wondering whether there's an opportunity to help small scale entrepreneurs or micro businesses someday pull together, make an offer, and purchase their buildings. Ethnic small malls and marketplaces anchored in local neighborhoods come immediately to mind. A second question, maybe we'll do that first one, and then the second question is, have you seen any good commercial retail TOPA policies when you've scanned other cities for their local practices? And I did just put it in the chat as well.
Thank you. I can take that question. So that was not part of the scope of what we were working on with this draft ordinance. This was specifically related to residential properties. I know that there has been some conversation around this in different parts of, from different community organizations, but I'm not aware of anything formal at the city having been introduced on this. I am trying to confirm that that's correct with one of my colleagues, and so I can, if I get an answer to that while we're sitting here, I will update. But the short answer is that was not part of the scope of this work. But and I am not aware of other cities that have done it, but again, we weren't specifically doing that research for this ordinance, so that doesn't mean there aren't any. It just wasn't part of this particular project. But if I do get some more information as we're sitting here, I will add more a little bit later. But I think we can move to the next question.
Okay, great. Are the timelines required in this ordinance on top of the city's advance notice of sale requirements, meaning this proposed ordinance has to be satisfied first, then a property owner needs to adhere to the advance notice of sale ordinance before it can go to market?
That is an excellent question. I actually might see if I can phone a friend here and from Joel to give some more thoughts on this, but I think that we will need to consider how they interact with one another. So right now, this is separate from that ordinance, and that ordinance also is in effect. But I think, Joel, I don't know if you have anything you could add on that right now, but I think that is something that we will need to provide additional clarity on if this ordinance were to be adopted and move forward.
Yeah, this is Joel Fussy from the City Attorney's Office. I think that's an excellent comment, and it was something that we're going to have to look into as we're looking at implementation as the process goes along. But I certainly appreciate the comment.
And Michelle, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add to that question.
I was just going to add that Joel and Dean and I did discuss this, and making sure that before final implementation that the timelines outlined in the advance notice of sale don't conflict with the timelines outlined in this, so that it can be as streamlined and easy as possible for residents and renters and property owners.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question says, when the ordinance says a majority of renters, does that mean a majority of households? One rental unit equals one household, or are you counting the number of adult renters in the building? I'm guessing it's the former household, but wanted to clarify.
Michelle, I think the question is about the majority, the statement that a majority of households in Minneapolis are renter households. Or are we talking about a majority of the ordinance itself? So I think we're probably talking about the second thing. So I'll turn it to Michelle, but since I brought it up, I will just say a majority of households in the city of Minneapolis are renter households. And I'll turn it over to Michelle to talk about the pieces of the ordinance related to a majority of renters.
The majority requirement referred to in the ordinance, that in smaller unit, 2 to 4 unit buildings specifically, where I talked about the majority of renters have to agree to proceed with a sale. That means, so in each unit, any renter who is on the lease who is 18 years of age or older is considered a renter. And so it would be a majority of any of the people who meet those requirements in the building. I hope that answers that question, or I believe that answers that question.
Okay, thank you. There's quite a few questions that are very similar, so trying to just group them together and ask them in a way that will hopefully cover a few of them. guess there's just kind of a question about a few different questions about the exemptions, and giving input as to why there are so many exemptions, and explain a little bit more explanation as to why the exemptions are put in place.
Michelle, do you want to handle that question?
I will try.
All right.
So there's been a fairly robust amount of conversation amongst our team and with community groups about, in particular, the exception for smaller rental properties that 1 to 4 units where it's owned by individuals and they have 5 or fewer rental properties in the city of Minneapolis. I believe that originally that was the direction we got from the city council. And so that was the direction that myself as a consultant and city staff have followed in drafting this ordinance. It is up to the city council, which of course has had some changes in composition as to whether or not they want to change those exclusions. So I'm focusing on the small unit rentals in particular because that has generated the most interest and discussion so far. I believe that their intent in creating that exclusion was wanting to not require kind of small mom and pop operations to have to be subject to this ordinance, as opposed to either individuals or corporations that had multiple rental properties and larger portfolios, was more the intent of the opportunity to purchase ordinance. Some of the other exclusions just align with both kind of prevailing case law and around property rights and personal interests. So for example, if it's a duplex and the property owner lives in one of the units, then they have more rights than if they don't live at the if they don't live in the property at all, because then it becomes like you're selling your own home that you live in, not just a rental property.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly to what Michelle said about there were a number of exemptions included in the framework that we received from the council, from the staff direction in March, and those were really based on the recommendations from the report done by CNHED and LISC, and the exemptions that were recommended in that report were based on review of, peer city reviews of other cities that have similar policies, and based on some of the experience from those communities. And so that's where those recommendations in the staff direction came from.
Thanks. I think you covered this a little bit, Katie, but there's a question again about, is there a timeline when you plan to implement after it has been presented to the new council?
Yes, thank you. So, we really can't give much detail on a timeline today because there is some uncertainty given the changes in council. As I mentioned, it would have to be reintroduced in the new council. So we don't know what that, if it will be or what that timeline will look like. And so we will certainly continue to provide information to stakeholders once we know more. But given where we are today, we really don't have details we can share on the timeline at this point.
And then again, combining a few questions to cover one topic, a few different questions coming in about the rationale behind the properties needing to be 10+ years old. I'm looking for more explanation on that.
I can take this one, and then Michelle, if you have more you want to add. The reason for that is during the stakeholder engagement that took place in 2020 during the development of the report on this, we heard from quite a few stakeholders who were concerned that it would affect new construction if the policy applied to new development, in that it would be difficult for developers to get financing for new construction if the policy applied to new construction. And we also know that many buildings are sold initially within the first few years after new construction, and so that was really the rationale for that that part of the ordinance. And I think that was it seemed during that stakeholder engagement that was that many people agreed on that across different stakeholder groups, that seemed like a reasonable policy or a reasonable part of the policy.
Okay, thank you. Gonna combine a few here. We have several different questions, again, kind of all related to just the work that's been done in Washington, D.C. already that we referenced. So if we have any more knowledge about what the overall effect on ownership was in D.C., maybe the comparisons between whether D.C. applied it to single families or not, and if they did not, why are we? And then there was, I think that's that might be about cover all of it. Just if we have any, if DC had any examples as well of it working, or any just examples of where it's worked. In general, that's another question. So I know that's broad, that's combining a few different ones here, but just again, the comparison to DC, what we found out from them, if they had examples of it working, and why some of our ordinance as it's written now differs from theirs.
Thank you. I will turn this one over to Michelle to answer, and then I'll add if there's anything else to cover on that. But Michelle, please go ahead.
Thank you. The LISC team, including Gretchen Nichols, did a great job doing pretty comprehensive analysis across the country in different municipalities on this question. In addition to that, in drafting the ordinance, I did look at some other ordinances that are both in development, kind of in process right now, being considered either statewide or in specific either counties or cities within a state, as well as at the DC ordinance and a few other ordinances in smaller municipalities that are currently in effect. We did take those into account when drafting this ordinance. So one specific example comparing to DC, since that is kind of our largest comparison, and that has been in effect for a little more than 20 years now. We did model a lot of this ordinance after the DC model, with a couple of notable exceptions. We did not talk a lot. I did not talk a lot during the presentation about assignment, but one of the things that concerns have been raised by a variety of different parties with different perspectives about is the assignment process in DC. The assignment process meaning renters being able to assign their rights to a qualified organization or something with a similar name. In DC, they can assign to an individual or an entity, and they can assign for rights or they can assign for cash. And there's been a lot of analysis and a lot of articles about how this has led to fraud and abuse and misuse of the policy, and has even led to further gentrification in some areas within DC. So when we were drafting this ordinance, we decided to limit assignment to renters, and renter organizations can assign only to qualified organizations, and they cannot assign for direct financial benefit, but they can negotiate rights related to their conditions as renters, including participation, control in decisions regarding the property, maybe some ongoing rent control measures, anything as long as it doesn't have a direct financial fiduciary benefit to any renter. And we did that not to be punitive, but to try to avoid some of the challenges that have been written about pretty extensively in DC.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Katie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think that covers it.
All right, here's next question. The OTP refers to the sale of the property. However, many properties owned by private entities may transfer to trustees, transfer on death, business transfer, etc. Do you define sale clearly in the ordinance, or does it include transfers of ownership as well?
Michelle, is that one that you can cover?
Muted. I can start, and then I would also invite Joel to add. So some of the exemptions, it depends on what kind of sale or transfer. Some of the exemptions include if the property owner transfers it to a family member, that would be exempted. If it's a fractional sale as a result of a corporate change in ownership that does not have a financial benefit. We did define sale in the ordinance. Joel, would you add anything else?
Hello, thanks, Michelle. I would just say that we have worked with our CPED real estate team to look at a lot of those transfer issues and kind of the more complex I guess, real estate issues with regards to sales. I would encourage you to look at the ordinance language that we have. It's got some pretty comprehensive provisions regarding exemptions and definitions along those lines. But that's, one of the purposes of this process. If you can identify something that you think hasn't been considered, we certainly would like to hear about it. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Next question. Does the rent stabilization provision take effect after the RO buys the building, or does it take effect during the transaction? I'm wondering if RO can raise rents to whatever level needed to cover capital improvements and debt service.
I'm not sure. Michelle, is this one you can start on? I'm not sure if I know the answer to this.
I'm not completely sure either, to be honest. I'm wondering if the person asking the question, or person or people, is referring to the rent stabilization or that was just passed in the most recent election, and how that will interact with the opportunity to purchase.
Okay, yeah, then maybe that is what they're getting at. So, so just to clarify, the city of Minneapolis, if that is what this question is, we'll I think assume that it is. The city, there was a charter amendment adopted that would allow the city council to consider a rent stabilization policy if they choose to do so. So there is not currently a rent stabilization policy in Minneapolis. It just allowed the city to pursue one if they chose to do so. The city of St. Paul, of course, did adopt a rent stabilization policy with their amendment, but that is not current. There is not currently a rent stabilization policy in the city of Minneapolis.
Okay, thank you. And you can always submit more if that didn't cover it. You can ask again and give us more clarification in the Q&A chat. Let's see, will qualified organizations and supportive partners receive funding through the city's RFP processes to support their work related to this policy?
I will answer that one. I think it would depend on if there was funding available. So the ordinance draft that we're presenting to you today is is an ordinance and separate from a budget process. So if this were to be adopted, the City Council could certainly choose to provide funding for that purpose, but that would be done through the budget process.
Thanks, Katie.
If I could add on to that briefly, we do have programs. We have the Minneapolis Homes program that provides funding for anyone in the city who's low and moderate income to purchase property. We have down payment assistance programs, and then we also have a stabilization program that currently is open for application. I'll put a link to our current NOFA in the chat.
Okay, thanks. Okay, here's another one. I was just reading another one. So in the draft ordinance under 246.40, exemptions and exemptions notice requirement, item 13, states that properties with rent restrictions would be exempt. With a rent stabilization ordinance, would a renter opportunity to purchase policy be obsolete?
So I'm not sure anyone can give a definitive answer on that today, other than to say that this was drafted assuming that there was not a rent stabilization policy, and so and that recommendation on the that exemption was part of the report we received last year from our consultants. So so I guess I think we can share that this draft ordinance was drafted under the assumption that there is not a rent stabilization policy in the city of Minneapolis. But I think there are a lot of unknowns in terms of whether this policy were to be adopted or a rent stabilization policy, how those would interact with one another. And so I think there would have to be a lot more analysis done if both of these policies are to continue or are to move forward. And I'd welcome additional comments from any of my colleagues on that if they'd like to add to that.
I'll just say I think that sums it up well, Katie. Thanks.
Okay. Would TOPA apply to residents in public housing?
Michelle, I don't know if you want to take that one. I think the answer is no, because it's publicly owned, but I invite you to add more to that.
The answer is no, because that's a publicly owned property and it's exempted.
Okay, I'm just kind of looking through again. We have some more similar questions, going to try to combine them if possible. Okay. If I understand this ordinance correctly, after an RO submits a statement of interest, the property owner is required to provide historical financial information. Is there consideration for an owner to provide private financial information? In the third-party market, interested parties are required for execution confidentiality agreements before receiving this type of information for good reason. Will ROs be required to sign and adhere confidentiality agreements under this ordinance with penalties for breaching confidentiality? I posted it in the chat as well if you want to read through it that way.
Michelle, is that one you can answer?
A little bit. So we did have a lot of discussion amongst our project team about how much information property owners and potential buyers would have to provide with some of the confidentiality concerns in mind. Right now, just like any property sale, there's not a specific confidentiality clause required. However, we will make note of that if it's a recommendation. Part of what will have to happen with this ordinance, like with any city ordinance, if and when it is ultimately adopted by the full city council, then city staff will have to do something called a compliance manual and a procedures manual, and there will be a lot more details like this question that need to be worked out in the process.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Next question. One of the exemptions of transfer types is if there's a building with all units vacant, except when tenants have been evicted. Will this include informal evictions or only evictions that are filed through the courts?
Michelle, go ahead if you want to take that one.
That is a great question. And right now the ordinance is silent on that, but myself and my team will make note on that, whether or not we want to potentially amend the language so that it is more explicit on the type of evictions.
All right, I'm gonna combine a few, again, that have kind of the same theme around just wanting some more information and clarity into why the smaller landowners aren't expected to comply with the ordinance, or around the just the exclusion of the smaller properties and why that was made. We have about 3 or 4 kind of all asking just for more information around why that exclusion is included in this draft. And also then on top of that, I guess one of them goes further to ask what could be done or what should be done to work towards removing that exclusion.
So I'll just share, just kind of reiterate what Michelle shared earlier, that the staff direction that we received in March is that the policy would apply to all rental housing with exemptions that included 1 to 4 unit buildings owned by an individual who has 5 or fewer rental licenses, 1 to 4 unit buildings that are homesteaded, relative homesteaded or partially homesteaded, and then the 5+ unit buildings that receive a certificate of occupancy within the last 10 years. So that was the direction that we received from the City Council. Again, that was in large part based on the report and analysis that was done in 2020. And I think in terms of the question of what can advocates do if they'd like to see that changed, I think certainly be talking to the City Council about what you would like to see in the ordinance and submitting comments as well, both through this process here, the smart sheet, the web form where you can submit comments, and then directly with the City Council are ways you can share that you would like to see that changed.
Thank you.
Megan, there are still quite a number of questions. I don't want to cut off questions if they're still coming in. I know we also wanted to leave some time for people to voice comments if they'd like to do so. So
Right.
do you have a sense for how many questions are left?
We do still have quite a few questions. I don't know if people are able to speak them or if we want to try to get through a few more. I know I'm trying to combine themes of the questions into one.
Well, let's take another 5 to 10 minutes on questions, and then we'll open it up for comments.
Sounds good. One talks about you've mentioned that there's benefit to landowners. Can you review what some of those benefits are or might be?
Michelle, is that one that you can comment on?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to comment on that. I'm sorry.
Okay.
This is Roxanne. I'm going to suggest that that's something that we will work to clarify in the procedural manual when the ordinance is passed, and it's a really good topic to bring up. So we'll seek to clarify that when we get to the point of doing a procedural manual.
Sorry, I was muted. Do we know what percent of, I'm not sure if we have this data on hand, it might be something we have to get back to. A question around what percentage of properties in North Minneapolis are Section 8? And how will they be expected to finance if on government assistance? I don't know if we have that data, or if it's something we're able to obtain.
I don't think that we do. We could potentially look into it. I think, and it's probably a question of how many properties have renters who have a housing choice voucher, and then also what percentage of properties are project-based Section 8. I believe if they have project-based Section 8 funding tied to the property, they would be exempt from the policy. But we would have to check with Minneapolis Public Housing Authority, I think, to find out what percentage of properties in North Minneapolis are renting to housing choice voucher holders. We don't know that information today.
Maybe one or two more here, and then we should probably open it up for comments. Do we happen to know how many other cities have successfully implemented this program? I think Michelle spoke earlier that we would be one of the largest municipalities to have this.
Go ahead, Michelle, if you can take that one.
So DC has had a similar ordinance for over 20 years, and other than that, there are several. There are about 3 states that are considering an ordinance like this statewide. There are a couple of counties and cities, including in Maryland has a couple, I believe 2 counties off the top of my head that has a similar ordinance, but not statewide. They're smaller counties within Maryland. San Francisco recently passed an opportunity to purchase ordinance, but it has some slightly different elements to it. Some other jurisdictions in California are considering a similar ordinance. Portland is considering an ordinance like this in Portland, Oregon, as well as Oregon is considering also a statewide similar ordinance. Just kind of off the top of my head.
Thanks, Michelle. I think we'll, there's 3 or 4 questions in here, kind of again, all around the same theme. So I'll pull one and use that. Maybe that will be our last question for just the Q&A portion. And that's just like, what measures are in place to prevent renters from using this ordinance to delay or prevent a sale when they do not have financial viability to make a purchase? And that's similar to just other questions that kind of are around the time period and the timing of what's given for renters to, I think, to go through this process. There's additional information around the timelines that are given for the.
So I can give a high level answer to that and then maybe ask Michelle to fill in details. I think there are timelines in the ordinance for different phases in the process. So for example, a renter would have to, a renter organization would have to submit a statement of interest. And if they don't do that, then the sale can just proceed. And then sort of steps follow in a similar fashion where there's specific timelines for specific parts of the process. And if you know, the financing doesn't materialize or other things, then the sale can proceed. And so I think that's the way that it can ensure that the process doesn't just sort of drag on indefinitely. But I will turn it over to Michelle to add more to detail.
Thank you, Katie. I guess the only thing I would add to that is this is part of why we took a slightly different approach to assignment than what Washington, D.C. is doing, because in terms of the ordinance being used as a method for renters to potentially just delay a sale or in some ways harass or annoy a property owner, for lack of a better word. It was a lot of the analysis, including from renters' rights and affordable housing advocates, has really been, from what I saw, on the side of allowing assignment for commercial or for capital gain has led to some of those challenges, which is part of why we made some modifications to the assignment, hoping to avoid some of that.
Thank you. Okay, thanks. I know there are still a few more in here. We will review all of them, and then I know Roxanne has posted some links for you to submit questions as well, additional questions. But I know we do want to leave time, a good chunk of time, for those who want to make comments. So I think we'll move on to that portion at this time. I did just post in the chat, maybe you can see it, the number if you'd like to call in. And then there's also a conference ID number that you'll need after that. So if you have comments you'd like to make, go ahead and call that number. We'll admit you in. We'll call you by your number that we're seeing call in. And then, as Katie mentioned, you'll have to dial *6 to unmute yourself. We are unable to unmute you, but you'll be able to dial *6 and unmute, and then talk. You'll want to just talk to us through your phone. So you'll maybe want to turn down, if you're on a laptop or a computer, turn down that one and just have the conversation with us through your phone, because you'll hear us that way. So I don't know if anyone else has anything else to add. Otherwise, we can maybe move to the comment portion. And if there aren't comments, maybe we can go back to questions.
Thank you, Megan. And I'll just, as we're having people dial in if they'd like to make comments, just a reminder that you know, the purpose of today is really to get feedback, be able to answer questions. This is a stakeholder meeting. It is not a public hearing, but we are grateful to receive feedback that can be considered as as this continues to be considered in the months ahead. So just wanted to ask everyone to keep that in mind, that this is really an opportunity to provide feedback. So the extent that you have really specific comments about aspects of the ordinance that staff should be aware of, that would be very helpful to hear. And so I think that's all I wanted to add. Oh, other than that, I don't know how many people are going to be calling in to give comments, but we do have quite a few attendees on the line. So if you can try to keep your comments to 2 minutes or less, that would also be very helpful, just in the interest of time.
So maybe wait another minute if anyone calls, and again, oh, we do have one. Okay. Great. So we have a call coming in from 651-294-3283. Hi, can you hear us? Press *6 to unmute yourself. Hi, welcome. It looks like we have a call from, oh, there you go. You're unmuted. Go ahead. We can hear you.
Yes, thank you so much for allowing me to ask another question.
Yep, go ahead. Oops, it looks like you muted yourself. So you'll need to hit *6 again. There you go. Hi, what's your question or comment?
Okay, thank you. I wanted to follow up on the timeline question, specifically with the last slide that was shown, because if you add up the dates, if I'm reading it correctly, for just a kind of mid-size apartment building, the resident organization would have up to 90 days to submit a statement of interest, then 90 days to submit an offer, and then another 120 days to get financing. That's 300 days. And in a market that we have, that's a significant timeline before it could go to third market, where a property owner is really going to suffer financial harm if the RO transaction doesn't close. And I want to know what consideration the city has taken for the property owner that has now been financially harmed because of this, the long timeline.
So thank you for that comment. I think that you know, this is a feedback session, so I think we will take that as feedback as this continues to evolve over time. I don't, you know, the timelines were based on a review, you know, stakeholder engagement, the study that was done last year, and a review of how this is done in other cities. And so we can certainly take your feedback into account. And make sure that's taken under consideration if this is reintroduced and moving forward next year.
Thank you.
All right, and it looks like we do have another. I'll get him in the middle. All right, hi, we have a call from 4081. Go ahead, press *6 to unmute yourself, and then we should be able to hear you. Hi, welcome. We have a call from 626-456-4081. Please hit *6 to unmute yourself, and we should be able to hear you. Try one more time. Hi, caller with the number 626-456-4081. Ready for your comments, so feel free to hit *6 to unmute yourself, and then we'll be able to hear you. Unfortunately, we are not able to unmute you. Hello?
Hello.
Hi, yes, welcome. Please share your comment.
Yeah, and certainly in looking at this program of OTP, it's at least by my evaluation, it appears very complex. It's potentially going to be very expensive. as far as its administrative aspects are concerned, and there's no guarantee of efficacy. Now, I wanted to find out specifically what data did the people who are involved in formulating this program looked at. Now, if they looked at data coming out of TOPA in Washington, D.C., I know in my own evaluation of what I could find through public access is that there is no definitive study looking at the effectiveness of this program. And when Gretchen Nichols was presenting an earlier version of OTP in February of this year to a Ward 2 Zoom meeting, she had stated that she did have data backing up the performance of TOPA. And I emailed her at that point asking her specifically what data she was looking at. And let me quote you her reply. "You are correct that there is no definitive analysis of the DC TOPA policy. The policy has lasted for over 40 years, which would indicate that it has served an important public purpose," which I think is certainly no justification for continuing a program, because as we know, there are many programs that are in existence that are not worth their beans. But in any case, I wanted to point out a few sort of glaring problems as far as I can understand it with TOPA. One being a very high failure rate of filings going to completion, and the other being a great inability to understand the true cost of processing these filings. But let me just go to the failure of filings. Back in the study session that was provided by representatives from the DC Department of Housing and Community Development, this was in September of 2019 and presented to the City Council at that time. They had presented data on filings under TOPA, and this covered years 2015 through 2019. And for 2 to 4 unit filings during this time, there was a total of 1,574 filings. For 5 and more units, it was 580. What they didn't include in this bit of data presentation is the filings for single-family units, in other words, single-family homes. And single-family homes were only removed from TOPA administration in 2018. Well, back in 2017, during a public hearing, the DC's Department of Housing and Community Development did present some data on single-family housing filings, and this covered the years 2006 to 2015. And there were a total of 398, and only 19 of these were successfully completed, which is approximately 5% of the filings. Now, the next question that any reasonable person would ask is, well,
sir, thank you. If you can wrap up your comment, we did ask people to keep it to 2 minutes, and it's been several minutes. So if you can try to wrap up in the next 30 seconds or so, we'd appreciate it. Thank you. Given
the number of 2 and 4 unit filings, over 1,500, and 5 unit filings of 580 during the 2015-2019 time period, how many of those were successfully completed? Well, additional data that was presented during that study session in 2019 tells me that the number of filings that were completed for the 2 to 4 unit buildings was probably extraordinarily low, but that wasn't the exact answer to that was not provided. And also, in looking at the 5+ unit filings, my guess is that probably about somewhere in the low digits were successful. So I'd like a response to that, but more specifically, what data specifically did the people composing OTP look at to give them an idea that this program would be successful in achieving its goals? Thank you.
All right, thank you for your comment. We do have another caller. So we will go to caller with their number in 1852, the number ending in 1852. Admitting you right now, it'll be you have been admitted. So go ahead and hit *6, and we should be able to hear you. Go ahead, caller, and with the phone ending 1852, go ahead and unmute yourself with *6 to leave your comment.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I am actually calling about a similar thing to the last caller. If there is no money that the city can put towards either a loan for pre-development expenses or capital improvement costs, resident organizations won't be able to complete the purchase of their buildings. They need some sort of financing in order to be able to cover the large capital improvement costs that will come. For many of these buildings will be old, and as we know, large corporate owners don't take very, there'll be large capital costs that'll be involved. And so is there any consideration about creating a fund, either a loan fund or a grant fund, so that resident organizations can buy, so that they can take out the money for the pre-development expense and to do capital improvements?
This is Roxanne Kimball, who manages our homeownership programs. I certainly think that we can take that as a comment or a recommendation for something for the council to consider. As Katie mentioned previously, our budgeting process is separate from setting an ordinance. So I think that that's something that we can certainly take as feedback.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It doesn't look like we have any other calls in queue at the time, but we'll wait. We'll give just another minute or so if there's other comments that you'd like to leave. Again, the number is in the chat. You also need the conference ID. When you come in, you'll need to press *6 to unmute yourself. We'll just wait another minute or two and see if we have additional comments coming in.
Megan, as we're waiting to see if anybody else calls in to make a comment, were there any additional questions in the Q&A that were not addressed that we could address now?
Yep, yeah, let me go back. Okay, so we had a follow-up from one of the earlier questions. Soren wrote in again. So from the draft 2461 covenants and reporting. A, if a QO purchases an RHA through the right of first offer or right of first refusal, the city will require covenants be filed and imposed on the property consistent with the following. A, rent stabilization. The RHA shall only increase rent once annually on each unit by no more than the consumer price index for urban workers. Does this apply after the sale or from owner to owner? Can RO increase rents to cover debt service and capital improvement? Do you think that was trying to clarify from the question we had a little bit earlier, and I'll publish it to be able to view it.
Michelle, can you address that question, please?
I can. This would apply after the sale occurs. And it, at least at this point, is not intended to cover debt service.
I'm seeing no additional calls. We will look for more questions.
Sorry, Megan, did you say there are no further questions?
No, I said there's no call, so I'm looking for more questions.
Got it. Thank you.
Right. Has there been any legal analysis regarding the city deciding who is in first position in real estate transactions?
Joel, is that a question you can handle?
Hello, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, it is. It's posted in the chat as well, but has there been any legal analysis regarding the city deciding who is in first position in a real estate transaction?
I can say that my office has, been conducting kind of an ongoing legal analysis of, what is admittedly a very complex ordinance, and that's ongoing. I don't know if I can speak directly to that question, however.
A very similar one to that came in was any legal analysis regarding restraint of trade via the use of preferred vendors, ROs, QOs. I'll publish that in the Q as well.
Again, I'll just say that obviously the city attorney's office is aware of this ongoing process, and we've been providing ongoing advice and will continue to do so, and are aware of many different facets that this implicates from a legal standpoint, and we're trying to address those as best we can.
Thank you, Joel.
And I would just add to that, as part of drafting the ordinance, I did do a legal analysis of not necessarily on restraint on trade, but potential restraints on property rights implicated by this ordinance.
Oh, so this one is a couple times, Raquel. So what are the zip codes that this ordinance passed? If there's a link that shows this, please share it. Are you, I guess, maybe a follow-up question, I know we shared some SREAP information, but it sounds like this question is just asking in general, will this be for the full city, or what zip codes is it going to be for?
This will apply citywide, but we did do an analysis of the impact of the exemptions, particularly the small unit exemptions, in every zip code across the city.
Yeah. And then just trying to again go through some questions with similar themes. Does the city anticipate that QOs can handle every transaction where interest exists?
I think that is one where it's a great question that I think we should kind of take back and take into consideration as discussions on this continue. I think it would also be something that we'll have to sort of flesh out in the implementation phase if this were to be adopted, in terms of, you know, there would have to be a process to select QOs, and I think part of the analysis that would go into creating that process would be to try to make sure that it's broad enough to have enough who can handle the number of transactions that might come through under this ordinance. But it's a very excellent question that we'll take into consideration as discussions on this move forward.
Sounds like it maybe not necessarily a question, but something that's missing. It might be an exclusion for someone in free foreclosure. The ordinance considers foreclosure broadly, but that's after transfer. If a seller can demonstrate that for a quick sale to a third party, the property would likely fall into foreclosure. They should be exempted. I have a statement, not necessarily a question, just something that can be considered.
Megan, we have just a few minutes left,
Yes.
so maybe we can do 1 or 2 more questions and then wrap up.
Right. Yep, we're getting down there too. Could landlord groups apply to be QOs?
Michelle is, I don't know if we have an answer to that today because we haven't developed the process, but I don't know if there's anything specific you can comment on related to that.
If they have experience with and a demonstrated commitment to affordable housing and meet the other criteria established by the city in the RFP once that is developed, I don't think there's anything that would stop them from applying. And if they meet the criteria, they would be considered just like any other applicant by the city.
Okay, I think that's a majority of the questions. Again, links to continue to submit questions or comments were provided in the chat. So if you have more, you'd like to make more comments, please do so and submit them there. But I think we've covered most of them, most all, and some were combined again into themes, but I think we've covered most all for today's session. I don't know if anyone has any closing thoughts.
Thank you for taking the time to attend today. We appreciate your interest and your feedback, which is very helpful to city staff and to policymakers. As I stated, we don't have definitive next steps to share today, but we will certainly update information on the website and hold future opportunities for engagement in the months ahead if the ordinance is reintroduced with the next council. So thank you so much for your time, and have a wonderful weekend.
Yeah.